So this past weekend, the Democratic Alliance held its federal congress, re-electing John Steenhuisen. He will take the party into next year's elections, which will, if the polls are accurate, see the ANC drop below 50% support and usher in coalition politics at all levels of government. Steenhuisen has also labelled the EFF political enemy number one, saying the worst scenario would be for voters to open the way for a coalition between the ANC and the EFF. Let's bring in political analyst Ebrahim Fakir. Ebrahim, thank you so much for joining us. Always fantastic to chat to you. So the DA delivered a Congress that was on time. It was all organised, all sorted out, which is stark contrast to the ANC's December conference. Of course, the ANC is a much larger organisation, but the DA, in many ways, ticking all the right boxes. What do you make, though, of their ability to capitalise on the shaky ground that the ANC is clearly on?
Sally, it's interesting that you point out the stark difference in the sort of political culture which animates and characterizes both of the what you would call gatherings, let's call it that, because the ANC is a genuine conference. The DA's is very slick, no doubt. It is extremely well choreographed. It plays out very well. But there is a tendency towards a kind of bureaucratization of politics. I mean, the ANCs are much more ideological. There's a real cut and thrust to the debate. There's a completely different political culture. And look, in some ways, one would think that for healthy democratic politics, the ANCs is the way to go. But for healthy democratic government, which is not the process of capturing power, but the process of actually administering and managing political power, the DA seems to have kind of got things absolutely right if their internal arrangements are anything to go by. The problem, though, is that public governance is very different from dealing with the internal governance and the internal mechanisms of a political party. I mean, here you're talking about people who are of like mind, people who have some sort of cohesive take on what their political trajectory is, who they are politically, and so on. And so it's a little easier to kind of manage that when you don't have the kind of diversity that makes up South Africa, not just in terms of race, but also in terms of its other social cleavages. It's much harder to govern. But you know, be that as it may, it is an indication that given where they govern, as the DA says, they do so relatively well. There are issues aside from how they reach out to constituencies and communities which have traditionally and typically been on the margins. But that, of course, is for voters to decide. But if the Congress is anything to go by, no doubt slick, well run, but a little bit of bureaucracy in politics.
I mean, I want to probe into their ability to bend in coalitions, because we know that they've been accused of being arrogant so many times. And as you say, there's quite clear sort of different ways of running their parties. Before we go there, though, I want to just talk to you about some of the messaging and how it's been interpreted. I was listening to a number of political commentators, Ongama Mtimka, talking about the way the DA is characterizing the EFF as political enemy number one. They say it's fear-mongering almost to the level of the old swart gevaar of the apartheid days. Adam Habib saying, but if you believe the EFF is a fascist party, as he does, as many people do, it's fine to call it political enemy number one. Where do you stand on the DA's positioning with number three, which is the EFF?
Yeah, I don't necessarily buy it, and I think, knowing me for as long as you do, Sally, you'd know, considering what I've written about the EFF, that I wouldn't necessarily consider them as my poll party for government, or even as a coalition partner. But be that as it may, they are a legitimate political formation, and they express a legitimate political view in the society. Their tactics may leave a lot to be desired. I genuinely do think, as I wrote somewhere else, that the EFF often talks left but lives right, and ideologically speaking, that is. And so, of course, I share somewhat of a bit of Adam's view. The EFF does itself no favors in the way in which it plays its political posture out. So there's no doubt about that. its kind of destabilizing approach to institutions, its divisive approach to society, kind of reeks of a colonial mentality and all of that. But be that as it may, there's no doubt that they have a constituency of political support, whatever their problems might be, however factionalized they might be inside the party. There certainly are different views about what the EFF should be doing. But calling them political enemy number one, I think is taking a little bit of political license. But hey, this is political campaigning. People are going to say this kind of thing. And I think that's not entirely inappropriate. But when you characterize someone as a political enemy, what you are doing is you are defining them a little bit outside of the political space. You're saying that the contestation really should not include these people because they are not genuine, real contestants in the political process. They're actually someone who wish to stand outside the political process. Now, in some ways, the EFF have behaved in ways which puts them outside of that, right? Particularly in the way in which they try to divide society, the kind of destabilizing impetus through some of their protest action, not just in institutions, but in society as well. But be that as it may, the reality of the matter is that by and large, the EFF, despite its excesses, does institutionally play within the rules. Of course, they test it to its limit. But to call them political enemy, I think, is taking a bit of political license. It is campaign season, and let's not make no mistake about that. Everyone's campaigning for next year's election already. And I think the DA has put its colors up. They're not prepared to work with the EFF. But isn't there a major contradiction here, Sally? It's the DA who went into coalition, not coalition, but called on the support of the EFF after the 2016 local government elections. So you have to kind of now think about the DA's consistency in its messaging. Does it like these guys? Does it not like these guys? Has the DA shown itself to be someone who's hypocritical in the sense that they are prepared to use people at certain points because they are convenient and then characterize them and demonize them in something else when they prove inconvenient? Now, you know, they are perfectly at liberty of characterizing their political opponents as they do, but they have to now work themselves out of this conundrum because they're the people who actually brought them into processes of governance in the first place after 2016.
It's so interesting. I mean, and you know, what do they say in politics? There are no permanent friends and no permanent enemies. But of course, you know, South African voters want people they can believe in, you know, and we know that the prospect of coalitions is very, very likely. We look at what's been happening, particularly in our metros here in Gauteng. I mean, it's a total mess. It's a mess, as JJ Tabane would say. We were chatting a little earlier about, you know, the DA gets criticised for being arrogant when it's in coalitions. You were talking about just very different sort of cultural ways of doing things in terms of political cultures. If you look at a post-24 national election that will mean coalitions have to be formed, it sounds crazy, but is a DA-ANC the best option potentially for voters, or do you see better pairings?
No, I see that as the pairing, a kind of grand coalition, if you will. And there are very specific reasons why I argue that this is the case. Some people would say that there's no policy proximity among them. There's no proximity in any kind of other political, cultural ways either. But I don't think that that's necessarily the measure of why we should have these two parties working together. For me, there are three very specific reasons why. The first, and most important of them, is that they are the two parties which genuinely reflect and command the support of identifiable constituencies in society, both in terms of race, but also in terms of class. So they genuinely can trace their roots and they can trace their support to some of the grassroots in society and in the different sectors that make up society, right? So they genuinely have a representative and they do represent a constituency in society, firstly. Secondly, they both have in their interest the continued institutional stability, both in terms of government processes as well as in decision-making processes. Third, they both respect the South African Constitution as indigenous, as crafted by indigenous people and serving an indigenous purpose through indigenous institutions. Fourth. And fifth is if you want some degree of social solidarity amongst people in society, because these are the two parties which represent the largest geographically and otherwise defined constituencies of support in society, it makes sense that they should work together for institutional stability and for purposes of social solidarity. That, for me, is what should drive the agenda now. All of the petty-mindedness in both parties aside, the one is going to say, no, we are going to be infected and inhabited by the problems of the ANC. The DA is going to say, no, we can't work with these guys because they will swallow us up. And the ANC will have hardliners who will say, but these guys have a racist pedigree. Why would we want to work with them? We have nothing in common with them. They have to put those differences aside for those two very particular reasons. And I'll repeat them: social solidarity and institutional stability. Now, Sally, you spoke about the fact that we have, what kind of recipe will we require for parties to work together? We have things in Gauteng which are a mess, etc. And they're a mess for precisely these two reasons. A, many of these parties who are in government don't trace any of their support to definable constituencies in society. It's very small. Second, very few of them have a fidelity to a set of principles. So they waver and they talk about all kinds of things like rainbow coalitions, like they did in Kenya about a decade ago. And look what happened. What happened in a country like Kenya is where there's no fidelity to principles. People get into bed with other parties merely because they want to access public office, and because they're accessing public office to access public office tenders for procurement, for influencing government contracts, and so on. That is the worst possible scenario for South Africa, because that doesn't even give rise to legitimate patronage politics, where people get into power to dispense patronage, but in fact gives rise to predatory politics. And our problem in South Africa is predatory politics, not patronage politics. And if you have any other kind of combination in coalition, I think we're looking at a disaster. But if you want institutional stability and social solidarity, for me, it makes sense that a portion of the ANC has to work with a portion of the DA.
Absolutely fascinating, and so much food for thought. Thank you so much, Ebrahim Fakir, political analyst, talking about the possible future scenarios for coalitions post the 2024 general election. We've got your business news.